Welcome back, everyone. Today we are going to deep dive into some fascinating and pretty complex issues that came straight out of a recent interview on Face the Nation with Kentucky Senator Rand Paul. So you sent us a few different things to look at, the CBS News summary of that interview, then the full transcript too, and then to get even more perspective, a couple of related articles, one from Politico and the other from The Hill. Looks like you are really trying to get a handle on all the legal and political twists and turns in this whole situation.
It's definitely a lot to unpack, and honestly, pretty timely, too. I mean, you are looking to understand how all this connects. We have the potential deportation of Venezuelan migrants. You've got this pretty bold rescission package being floated around that's aimed at clawing back, $500 billion in federal funding. And then always a hot topic, the role of the Department of Education and how much federal money should be going into education in the first place. I think it's going to be really interesting to see how these different pieces of the puzzle fit together.
Yeah, no doubt. I'm ready to jump right in if you are.
Absolutely. Let's do it.
Okay, so let's start with the first big issue that kind of caught my eye, which is the deportation of Venezuelan migrants to El Salvador. And this was a focal point when Margaret Brennan was interviewing Senator Paul. She brought up some pretty concerning reports, where it seems like some individuals who were deported, they might have been mistakenly identified. Like in one case, it seemed like the reason was because of the person's gender. And then in another case, it turns out the person being deported wasn't even from Venezuela in the first place.
You can see why that would raise some serious questions about how these decisions are being made. And, Brennan really pressed Senator Paul on this, especially when you consider the fact that there doesn't seem to have been a lot of due process involved. And then you have family members claiming that a lot of the people who were deported had nothing to do with gangs, which was kind of the initial justification.
Yeah, that was a big part of it. And, what I found really interesting about Senator Paul's response was how he kind of pointed to this really fundamental conflict that we have in our legal system. Yeah. On the one hand, you have the Bill of Rights, which everyone knows, and that applies to everyone in the U.S., all persons, not just citizens. And you'd think that would mean that anyone on American soil has the right to due process. But then you have this other law, the Alien and Enemies Act, which is actually pretty old, something like 200 years old. And that law basically gives the president a ton of power when it comes to foreign policy stuff, including who gets deported and who doesn't.
And that tension right there is exactly what makes constitutional law so fascinating and so challenging sometimes. Trying to find that balance between individual rights and the government's need to protect national security is a debate that goes all the way back to the founding of the country. Senator Paul was basically saying that the Alien and Enemies Act, especially when there are worries about national security, has been used in the past to let the executive branch, the president and his administration, kind of bypass some of the normal legal procedures when they're dealing with people who aren't citizens. He even said that he thinks if this went up to the Supreme Court, they would probably uphold the act because of how the court has ruled in similar cases, like the recent TikTok decision, where they basically deferred to Congress because of national security concerns. But it is worth noting that he did specifically say that this wasn't necessarily his own view, just his prediction of how the court would probably rule.
But I still feel like even if it is legal, the reports of people being deported by mistake, like Brennan and the ACLU were talking about, that just raises all these red flags about whether that broad power that the president has is being misused or maybe even abused. I think Brennan was right to follow up about due process. I mean, how can we square the idea of basic human rights with a law that basically seems to sidestep them? And what about actually verifying the accusations against someone, like whether they're really involved in gangs, before they get kicked out of the country?
That's a great question, and it's a real ethical dilemma. Senator Paul basically said that he thought the courts would probably still require some kind of due process before deporting people in most situations. But he wasn't as sure about cases that specifically fall under the Alien and Enemies Act, which is pretty worrying, right? Because it suggests that there's a lot of ambiguity and that this law could be challenged in court, and we don't really know how that would all play out.
Right, exactly. And that's where the other articles you sent me really come in. They had a whole other dimension to this discussion. Like, Democratic Representative Jim Himes. He didn't mince words. He called what the Trump administration was doing an unbelievable cocktail of incompetence and illegality.
Yeah, he definitely didn't hold back.
Mm-hmm.
And what I thought was really striking was how strongly he argued against using the Alien and Enemies Act in this case with the Venezuelan migrants. He pointed out that the act very specifically says that there has to be a formal declaration of war for it to apply. And we don't have a declared war with Venezuela, right? Even if some people are saying that they're acting on behalf of someone we are at war with.
Right. And Brennan and Himes, they both mentioned this New York Times report that said that, according to intelligence sources, the Venezuelan gang that they're so worried about doesn't actually have any ties to the Venezuelan government at all. So that completely undermines the whole argument for using the Alien and Enemies Act, which is usually reserved for situations where we're actually at war with another country.
And it goes even further than that. It raises a huge question about whether they even have the facts straight before they start invoking these wartime powers. And on top of all that, there's also been legal pushback. District Judge James Boasberg actually ordered the administration to stop those deportation flights, to turn them around. And the administration, while they said they were following the order, they also accused the judge of being biased, which just adds another layer of complexity.
It's crazy. And then when you hear the stories from the people who are actually being affected, it's really heartbreaking. The ACLU attorney, Lee Gellert, he talks about some pretty serious mistakes that happened during these deportations. Like, there were people who weren't even Venezuelan citizens who got put on those flights. And then there were these cases where women were denied entry into El Salvador when they arrived and then sent back. I mean, they just ended up stuck in this horrible limbo.
Yeah, and it really shows you how when these really broad legal powers get used, especially when it seems like they're making these fundamental mistakes about who people even are, there's a very real risk that innocent people are going to suffer. Yeah. It goes back to that question you asked earlier. How do we as a nation make sure we're protecting national security without trampling on people's basic rights, even if those people aren't U.S. citizens? And when do these old laws that were written for a different time stop making sense in the world we live in today?
Absolutely. Well, let's shift gears a bit and talk about the second big issue that Senator Paul talked about in the interview. His plan to try and get back $500 billion in federal funding that Congress has already approved. And he even talked to Elon Musk about it.
That definitely got people's attention. It's an incredibly ambitious idea, and the way he wants to do it is by using something called a rescission package, which basically means that he's asking Congress to take back money that they've already allocated. And to do that, he needs a simple majority vote in both the House and the Senate.
And that brings us to a whole other set of legal questions, this time about the balance of power between the president and Congress, specifically when it comes to deciding how the government spends its money. Senator Paul was talking about whether the president actually has the power to just impound funds, which basically means refusing to spend money that Congress has already approved, or does he have to go through this formal process of getting Congress to rescind the funding if he wants to change how much is being spent?
Right. So think of impoundment like the executive branch hitting pause on spending money that Congress already gave the green light for. And Senator Paul's view seems to be that the president might be able to temporarily pause spending before the end of the fiscal year. But if he wants to actually impound funds, especially for a longer period of time, then he would need Congress to sign off on it through a rescission package. But he also brought up the fact that the Trump administration had a different interpretation of this, saying that the Empowerment Act gave them more leeway to control how money gets spent. So it looks like this issue, just like the Alien and Enemies Act, could end up in the Supreme Court to be sorted out.
But it doesn't sound like Senator Paul's too confident about getting this rescission package through Congress. He knows it's going to be really tough to get Democrats on board with cutting that much spending. And he even brought up a time during the Trump administration when they tried to rescind a much smaller amount, and it didn't even get enough support from Republicans to pass.
Yeah, so his strategy now seems to be to try and get enough Republican senators to agree beforehand so that he has the votes lined up before he even tries to get the whole rescission package through, which just shows you how slim the margins are in Congress and how important it is for parties to stick together, which, as we all know, doesn't always happen.
So what you're really getting at is, if this proposal actually went through, it would have massive consequences. We're talking about $500 billion being taken away from government programs and agencies. That's huge.
It really is. And it makes you think about the ripple effects. Which programs would be hit the hardest? What would it mean for the economy and for people's lives? There would be a lot of intended consequences, but also probably a lot of unintended ones, too.
All right, let's move on to the last big topic from these articles. The Department of Education and the whole debate about how much federal money should be going into education. Margaret Brennan pointed out that Senator Paul's home state, Kentucky, actually gets a lot of federal education funding per student, and they have over 900 Title I schools. You know, those are the schools that get extra federal funding to help students from low-income families.
That was a really important point for Brennan to make because it highlights how much Kentucky relies on federal funding to support its schools, especially those serving underprivileged students. And it really set the stage for Senator Paul's response, which wasn't so much about the amount of money, but more about the results.
Right. He was basically saying that, yeah, we're putting a lot of money into education, but kids still aren't doing well in reading and math. Not in Kentucky, and not across the country either. He said the whole system is an utter failure, and that just throwing more money at it isn't going to fix it.
His solution, which a lot of Republicans agree with, is to scale back the federal government's role in education and give more control back to the states. The argument is that states know their own needs better and that teachers feel stifled by all the rules and standardized tests that come from the federal level.
And Brennan asked him point blank, if we shrink the Department of Education, or even get rid of it completely, what happens to the money that Kentucky schools rely on, especially those Title I schools? Would they still get that federal funding?
Senator Paul made it pretty clear that his priority is getting better results in education, even if that means completely changing how the federal government funds it. He didn't promise that the current funding levels would stay the same if the states took over.
And he actually suggested some pretty out-there ideas for how to make education better. Like, he talked about using NBA or NFL-level teachers, maybe using technology or something to let those really great teachers reach more students, and then have local teachers help reinforce what they're learning. And he also said he doesn't think we even need a big Department of Education to do things like testing and setting standards.
It's a pretty radical vision where the federal government takes a backseat and lets states and individual teachers take the lead. The thinking is that if you give them more freedom and flexibility, they'll come up with better ways to teach kids. And it goes back to your question about whether the way we fund education now is really working. And if there are other ways to do it that might actually get better results for students, it really makes you think about how much control the federal government should have over education and how much should be left up to the states.
So, to wrap up this deep dive, we've gone through some really weighty legal and political questions. We talked about whether the Alien Enemies Act is even constitutional and what limits there should be on using it to deport people. We talked about who really gets to decide how the federal government spends its money and what happens if Congress tries to take back funding through a rescission package. And we talked about the role of the Department of Education and whether it's doing more harm than good.
Exactly. And all of this leads to one final thought for you to consider. We've seen that there are a lot of different ways to interpret the law, and there are strong opinions on both sides of these issues. So, what do you think the long-term effects of all this are going to be? What will it mean for people's rights in this country? How well will our government be able to function? And what will happen to education in the U.S.? Think about how this push and pull between old laws and how we understand them today will continue to shape the way our country works in the years to come.
And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive. We'll see you next time.
See you then.